Greetings, esteemed hosts, colleagues, and guests. There are three major points I want to emphasize today at this historic forum in this crucial juncture of world history. The first is to emphasize the significance of international scientific cooperation as UNESCO, the International Peace Research Association, which I represent as Secretary General, and many other associations have laid foundations of for decades. The second is to emphasize the significance of the still young and growing field of peace research and study, whose founders have pointed the way to this moment and whose up-and-coming members may well hold the key to our collective future. The third is to emphasize the significance of Nanjing and how the work done here in this city at Nanjing University must be understood as a global model for social change and human progress. One, it is easy to assess that the world today is spiraling in global crises of multiple sorts, with varying degrees of hardship, depending upon one's geography, ideology, and practice. In the USA, where I was born and raised, a third-generation citizen from New York City, the crisis manifests as three interrelated pandemics: health, economic, and judicial. COVID-19 rages out of control as the federal government has become the major denier of science within this nation, the super spreader of death amongst our people. Please note that this is far from simple rhetoric on my part. The prestigious New England Journal of Medicine, the oldest and longest consistently published medical journal in US history, founded just 30 years after my nation's founding, broke precedent last week and for the first time in their history endorsed a candidate for president, noting that the current President Trump is in fact unhealthy for the country. What then has all this to do with UNESCO, IPRA, and the need for greater scientific cooperation? Allow me to start with our matriarch, Dr. Elise Boulding, co-founder of IPRA, board member of the United Nations University, and a leading figure in UNESCO work on building a culture of peace. 20 years ago, when UNESCO led work within the UN structures to produce educational materials spotlighting scientific research dedicated to peace processes, Dr. Boulding reminded us, and I quote, "A peace culture can be defined as a mosaic of identities, attitudes, values, beliefs, and patterns that leads people to live nurturingly with one another and the earth itself without the aid of structured power differentials, to deal creatively with their differences and to share their resources. Violence is more visible and gets more attention in our history books and in our media than peace does, but peace culture will take us where we want to go." Dr. Boulding continued, and I quote, "In doing this kind of work, we need great clarity of mind, keen powers of observation, good listening skills, but most of all, we need a kind of grounding in what it means to be human on this planet. What is our relationship with all living things? And how do we become what humans could become? How can we grow? How can we grow in our humanity?" Close quote. It seems to me that what Boulding is saying to us today, in addition to her definite emphasis on the power of women as peace builders, is that a mixture of provable scientific investigation on the one hand and personal humanitarian exploration are needed together to produce the kinds of futures worthy of our species and Anthropocene. It will take academics and activists, cultural workers and factory workers, the highly educated, as well as some indigenous common wisdom from those without formal education. Who then would be better suited to bring this mix of peoples into structured dialogue and collaborative, future-oriented analysis than those organizations which have been on that path all along? We can look back 30 years ago at the work of our predecessors, but we can also look more recently at the work of IPRA colleague at the United Nations headquarters in New York, Dr. Emily Welty, who went on to help found the 2017 Nobel Peace Laureate International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Dr. Welty was one of those in 2016 whose engagement on disarmament and denuclearization earned recognition for IPRA, very rare for an NGO, in the annual report of that other Secretary General, the then SG of the UN, Ban Ki-moon. But we can go even closer to recent history. We can look back less than 1 year ago, as Chinese Vice Minister of Education and leading UNESCO associate Tian Jian visited West Africa and the University of Ghana's Confucius Institute, stating clearly our collective need to, quote, contribute to the building of a shared future for humankind, close quote. And since we are now conceptually momentarily in Ghana, it is worth noting the traditional Akan image of the Sankofa bird. Sankofa is the Adinkra symbol, the Adinkra concept that one looks back in order to move forward. The science of the future must be rooted in the dialectic which UNESCO, IPRA, and our colleagues already know so well. The science of the future extends the idea of culture for peace to a culture of justice and liberation for all humankind. 2. To segue to my second major point, the significance of contemporary peace research, I will briefly quote another IPRA founder, the father of peace studies, Dr. Johan Galtung. It should be no headline news here that in his 2009 book, Galtung predicted the imminent fall of the US empire, much as he correctly predicted the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union 10 years before those events. In the initial writing, Galtung suggested that the Obama era would extend the longevity of the empire, but could not about face its ultimate demise. With a detailed list of 15 contradictions, Galtung concluded that there were two fundamental choices for a post-imperial US: fascism or a new blossoming. Galtung summarized that the US empire is defined by, and this is a quote from him, unlimited freedom for violence and war, but the constant suppression of freedom for peace and human rights, close quote. Without going into the minutia of Galtung's 15 points, it is hard not to see his body of work today as a striking vindication of the peace studies field and discipline which he helped to birth. While it might be true that the empire will not end by New Year's Day, the multidisciplinary approach which led Galtung and so many of us to our nuanced conclusions to the broad and transformative frameworks through which we study the world. Never confined to a simple singular lens, peace studies has forced us to become political economists, to include the sociological and anthropological aspects of history, to theorize the hard sciences in non-linear ways. Our approach explicitly demands that our experiments seek more than one truth or one singular simple conclusion. Peace research and peace studies eschew the false pretenses of objectivity, understanding that social sciences and social change must be interconnected through a process that leans towards progress for all. Now, we are aware that there are those, including Sishan University professor Deng Shizi, who refute Galtung's predictions on the basis that his lack of horizontal criteria renders his conclusions invalid. Furthermore, Professor Deng suggests that there is no alternative ready to fill the gap if the world's sole superpower were to cease its global function. And while it is beyond the scope of this intervention to argue these points in detail, it is worth noting from New York today that a holistic peace studies framework has thus far described this moment in US history with greater accuracy and precision than any other overview. An outside scholar may be forgiven for writing, even as he recently did late June, this is Deng now, that, quote, the US wins an economic strength and on political stability. Though it is likely true that we will not wake up in 2021 to find a wholly transformed and weakened US, thus disappointing Galtung's 2020 prediction by the year, one must not underestimate the fragility of what the world sees as a US democracy. Parts of the US economy will indeed likely bounce back, but that reboot will affect a precious few. For the rest, there will be an unprecedented increase in repression, which will be required to manage the collapsed economy. This will hit simultaneous to sustained intergenerational racial justice uprisings, which have already grown beyond anything seen thus far in US history. Taking place in the midst of a crippling health crisis, which has undermined an already shaky political scene, there is a congruence of fault lines from which old-style superpower hegemony cannot revive. The US will continue to exert military, political, and economic influence, to be sure, just as regional superpowers with their own potentials will also grow. A revised prediction from this peace scholar will suggest to you today that 2024 and 2028 will be much more important periods to prepare for. 2020 reveals publicly the weakest spots of US capitalism and electoral federalism. But it will be in the next half decade, however, I assert, when the deeper contradictions internal to US settler colonialism will likely explode on the world stage. Peace research is the space where building an intellectual, academic, and practical bloc against fascism will best develop. 3, finally, what then brings us to Nanjing, and why is Nanjing a global model for social change and human progress? First, to be sure, there is symbolism. What could be more empowering? Here we have a major center of peace studies, respected regionally and globally for its consistent engagement and leadership, coming from the center of China at a time of heightened sensitivities to international power struggles, economic imbalances, socio-cultural emergencies, military unrest. And here in Nanjing, we have a recognized space where the development of the culture of peace and justice has become institutionally ingrained. Also, beyond symbolism, however, there is the science. We have followed as Dr. Louis Cheng and his students develop ever more thoughtful and critical work on topics as crucial today as sustainability and climate science, solidarity and conflict resolution, pluralism and diversity. Their research has helped shape and guide policy and has enriched the global field in ways both practical and theoretical. In Nanjing today, we have a model where science and academic pursuits lead the way towards building a lasting peace, not based solely on hopes or dreams, but on histories which lay a foundation stronger than we have ever seen in the past. Therefore, I close this presentation by saluting the Institute for Peace Studies, the Nanjing Peace Forum, UNESCO, and all of our sponsors. My only regret is not being in person to fully tour and experience the International City of Peace, a problem I plan on rectifying as soon as a visit becomes physically possible. Building holistic and pluralistic visions of peace is the responsibility of all of us. Scholars and academics, however, have the scientific tools necessary to create, shape, and mold the building blocks which will ensure the strongest possible foundation. Let us use our tools together and well, and build the world which all of the beautiful people in it deserve to live in. Thank you.